Distinguished ambassadors, distinguished guests. Good morning to you joining us from America. Good afternoon to our guests from Europe, and good evening to the dear participants from the East. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to today's online briefing in our series of webinars where important topics related to nuclear arms control are being discussed. My name is Christina Baumann from Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Berlin. I welcome you on behalf of Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Vienna, of the Multilateral Dialogue, and of Atomic Reporters, our cooperation partner for this webinar series. Today, we will elaborate on the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the most recent developments that are taking place right now. The 10th NPT review conference has been further postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic and is now expected to be held from the 1st till the 26th of August at the United Nations in New York. One can say that the NPT treaty is the most successful and multilateral legally binding instrument, which is governing nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament, and cooperation in the peaceful use of nuclear energy. An expectation of the review conference being held last month, as was previously scheduled, the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapon states issued a joint statement on 3rd of January. And the UN Secretary General also commented and outlined possible actions by NPT states. I am very glad to warmly welcome our speakers of today: Maria Antonieta Hakis, Ambassador Gustavo Zlabanen, Ambassador Jakob Holgren, and Ambassador Alexander Kmit. We will start with a video address by Izumi Nakamitsu, who unfortunately cannot join us for the discussion today. I will now pass the floor to Tariq Raouf, who will be moderating this seminar. Tariq is board member of Atomic Reporters and former head of verification and security policy coordination at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. Dear Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christina. I too would like to welcome everyone joining us from Vienna and from places around the world for this very interesting discussion today. Thank you for attending. This session is being recorded. The video recording will be put up on the websites of Atomic Reporters, as well as the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and also on their Facebook and YouTube pages. The opinions and views expressed here today are those of the presenters and the speakers and do not necessarily represent the view of the organizers. This online discussion will be moderated. People in the audience can put up their questions and comments in the chat function, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible once the speakers have finished. So to examine the various aspects of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and related recent developments, we are very fortunate to have a stellar panel of senior experienced practitioners. The order of speakers will be Izumi Nakamitsu, United Nations Undersecretary General, High Representative, Office of Disarmament Affairs. We have a recorded message from the Undersecretary General from UN headquarters in New York. After that, we will have Gustavo Zlabanen, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Argentina. He is the President-designate of the 10th NPT Review Conference, now scheduled for August this year, previously Deputy Foreign Minister, and also Undersecretary for Foreign Policy in Argentina. Then we will have Alexander Kmit, Ambassador, Director for Disarmament, Arms Control, and Non-Proliferation at the Austrian Ministry for Foreign Affairs. He is the President-designate of the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and also to the 4th Conference on the Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear Weapons to be held later this year. Then we will have Jakob Holgren, currently Ambassador for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Sweden. Starting from next week, he will be the director of the Swedish Institute for International Affairs. Previously, he has served as ambassador of Sweden to the Republic of Korea and was deputy director at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And last but not least, we will have Maria Antonieta Hakis, counselor and senior diplomat in charge of disarmament issues at the Permanent Mission of Mexico at the United Nations in New York. Previously, she has served as Acting Director General for UN and also Deputy Director General for Disarmament at the Foreign Ministry of Mexico and Representative of Mexico to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. As we all know, the 10th NPT Review Conference, which was scheduled to have been held in January, has been postponed yet again due to the coronavirus, and at the moment is scheduled for August this year, unless some other venue can be found before that date. The postponed 10th NPT Review Conference now is running up against the first preparatory committee meeting, which normally would have been scheduled for April or so in Vienna, for the 11th NPT Review Conference to be held in 2025. And no doubt we will have some discussion on this as well. The NPT review process, the NPT review conferences, which are held every 5 years, and the preparatory committees are the only forum where the 5 nuclear weapon states are prepared to engage with the non-nuclear weapon states on nuclear disarmament. And it's only in these fora that they have accepted commitments, binding commitments to move on nuclear disarmament. Unfortunately, we haven't seen as much progress as we would like to have seen. Today, there are still more than 13,000 nuclear weapons deployed at 104 locations in 14 countries. The doomsday clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is still at 100 seconds to midnight. That is the Armageddon of a nuclear war and also climate change. In expectation of the review conference, the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapon states issued a statement in which they talk about nuclear risk reduction, but we didn't see a recommitment to implementing the commitments that they have undertaken in the NPT review process, although they do commit themselves to implement the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The UN Secretary General has outlined 6 actions for NPT states to consider whenever we have this 10th review conference. The Pope also steadfastly continues to maintain that in the 21st century, nuclear arms are an inadequate and inappropriate means of responding to security threats. Meanwhile, as we all know, relations between Russia and China on the one hand, and the 3 Western nuclear weapon states and their allies on the other hand have been steadily deteriorating, to the extent now that there perhaps is a real risk of a war in Europe. New defense arrangements such as AUKUS are projected to lead to the spread of nuclear-powered submarines to non-nuclear weapon states and the exemption from IAEA and NPT safeguards of the nuclear fuel and the nuclear reactors for such submarines. This issue already has created tensions in the IAEA's Board of Governors, and no doubt will also feature at the review conference when it is held. New arms control initiatives for the 10th NPT review conference, inter alia, such as the Stockholm Initiative on stepping stones for nuclear disarmament, existing concerns about the humanitarian consequences of the nuclear weapons enterprise, the first meeting later this year of the parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the UN conferences on the Middle East in terms of the 1995 resolution on a nuclear weapon-free zone and a WMD-free zone in the Middle East also are issues that will impact the review conference. So all this to say that we have a rich, albeit worrisome, agenda concerning the NPT and the upcoming review conference. So now let us commence our discussion. And as mentioned, we will start with a video message from UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitsu.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to send this message. I would like to thank the multilateral dialogue of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the Atomic Reporters for hosting this event. The multiple postponements of the 10th NPT Review Conference due to the COVID-19 pandemic have been immensely frustrating, given the important role the treaty plays in international peace and security. While states parties work to find new dates following the latest postponement, events such as this, which focus on substance of the review conference, help remind all stakeholders that simply holding the conference is not the end of the process. States parties must work to ensure that when the review conference is held, it is meaningful and strengthened implementation of the NPT across all three of its pillars. From my perspective, there are numerous issues on which common ground can be expanded and divergences narrowed in order to achieve success. First, success will not be possible unless states parties move the needle on disarmament. Many states parties are concerned that previously agreed disarmament commitments remain unfulfilled. A successful review conference will need to examine how to accelerate implementation of these commitments. Second, the geostrategic landscape is very different than even in 2015. As relations between nuclear weapon states continue to sour while in parallel they improve their nuclear capabilities, the prospects of miscalculation and escalation have risen dramatically. The NPT is the only multilateral venue that can agree to urgently needed initiative to reduce the risk of a nuclear weapon being used. In particular, states parties need to increase focus on the burgeoning nexus between nuclear weapons and new domains and new weapon systems with strategic effect. The recent joint statement by the nuclear weapon states was a positive start in this direction and something that should be embraced and built upon at the review conference. Third, risk reduction is not enough. These measures should lay the groundwork for practical steps in disarmament, such as further reductions in arsenals, negotiations on the next generation of arms control measures, and the verification of nuclear disarmament. Fourth, the remarkable success of nuclear non-proliferation regime cannot be taken for granted. Emerging technologies threaten to expose loopholes in the safeguard system. There is still no consensus on what constitutes the safeguards standard. The Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement is still not universal. The conference should address and make progress on all these issues, and it must help ensure that IAEA is appropriately resourced, both in human and financial capital. Fifth, and finally, inclusivity has been a persistent theme for this review conference. There is a growing understanding that a wide variety of expert stakeholders and perspectives can be instrumental in producing a successful result. From civil society to industry to youth groups, each can add value to states parties' deliberation. It should go without saying that equal representation of women and men at the review conference and an enhanced role for women in leadership positions would also be beneficial to success. No matter when it is held, success at the 10th review conference would depend on states parties' willingness to engage openly, negotiate in good faith, and display flexibility. I will continue to encourage all stakeholders to support such endeavors. I thank you very much for your attention.
So we thank Undersecretary General Nakamitsu for her important message to us here today. And particularly one of the points that she made was that nuclear risk reduction measures are no substitute for actual reductions in nuclear weapons. She also pointed to the verification standard at the IAEA for non-nuclear weapon states party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That is a comprehensive safeguards agreement together with an additional protocol. And she also mentioned improving the participation of women. Normally at NPT review conferences, we see a sea of dark suits and not enough women. And I hope many delegations will find it now possible to have more balance, more gender balance in their delegations to the review conference. Undersecretary General Nakamitsu's message will be put up also on the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs website later today, and we thank her again for her message. So now may I invite President-designate Ambassador Gustavo Zlabanen, who is now the longest serving official in this capacity, to update us regarding the much postponed NPT review conference and related developments.
Thank you, Tariq. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Some lighting issues here anyway. I want to thank first for this invitation to participate in another webinar of the multilateral dialogue, and in particular the Konrad Adenauer Foundations and the Atomic Reporters for organizing this series of webinars and dialogues, and to you in particular, Tariq, for keeping up with the latest developments and challenges on these very important issues. So thanks very much. And I believe that our representative for Disarmament, UN Disarmament, Izumi Nakamitsu, already addressed the important substantive issues that state parties and other stakeholders are going to be facing when we meet at the 10th NPT review conference. So not to repeat or reiterate those concepts, which I share in full and have addressed them in previous interactions. Let me just brief you and the audience about where we stand with regard to the preparation, so the preparatory works for holding the review conference. You have already mentioned, and Ms. Nakamitsu already mentioned, that the state parties have decided to postpone yet again the review conference. We were supposed to meet in New York beginning of January, but because of the Omicron variant and the challenges to not only to the conference, to the delegations, but also to the UN staff, that would have entailed going ahead with the meetings in January, made it reasonable and responsible decision to postpone the review conference again. Obviously, it was very disappointed. I believe that delegations and the UN and myself, we were ready to finally meet in New York. A lot of preparatory work had been done before that, but it was the sensible decision at that time. Obviously, the challenge we face now is to secure a date in which we can hold our conference in as much as a full-fledged format as originally envisioned. And this is the view of the great majority of state parties, that in order for the conference, as Mrs. Nakamitsu mentioned, and I think just many others are using that terms that I coined it 2 years ago, a meaningful review conference, and as I agree with her, a conference that will help to strengthen the implementation of obligations under all three pillars. We will need to keep working on finding that date and the venue. For the time being, since the postponement of the conference in January, we have, or at least I, as President-designate, I have requested the UN Secretariat to put a hold on the dates in August this year to have the review conference. Now, for many state parties, they believe that the August dates are a bit too late. but also it will overlap with other very important and major disarmament conferences and meetings, among others, and in particular the PWC conference, as well as the arms trades and the CD and other and the cluster munitions meetings. So they have asked myself, and they have asked the Bureau to look into the other options to have the reconference in a much earlier date. One possibility will be to swap the dates, the August dates, with the UNDC, the United Nations Disarmament Commission, that has the dates set in April. Now, the problem for that swap being that normally the UNDC has a 3-week slot, while the NPT reconference it needs 4 weeks slots. Secondly, the NPT reconference requires parallel meetings, at least during 2 weeks, meaning that will require 2 large conference rooms at the same times. And the UNDC has only allocated 1 room, and the other available room at UN headquarters currently being used have been allocated to other 4 meetings and conferences which have a mandate from the UN General Assembly, so they have priorities. So that makes it a bit difficult to swap the dates, but still it's we are working with the UN Secretariat, DGACM, through the Provisional Secretary General, Mr. Johan Tudor, to see whether there is any chance that we can swap the dates, get an additional week, get an additional room, and then have our reconference in April. Now, the other options that we are looking into, and the state party have agreed that the Bureau will look into that, is to find other dates, earlier dates, in other UN venues and locations, being in Geneva, Vienna, but also it could be in Nairobi, or it could be in Bangkok. So we are looking into that. For the time being, what I understand is that there are no rooms, no conference rooms available for a 4 weeks review conference, neither in Geneva nor in Vienna at UN premises. We are looking into other UN venues, as I mentioned, and hope to have some clarifications in the next few days. The third option that state parties have in principle agreed to look into that will be to see whether we can find non-UN venues or non-UN facilities at other venues rather than New York, which will mean that to have the reconference in either government-sponsored conferences facilities or commercial conferences facilities in other capitals rather than New York. In that sense, have formally approached 3 governments in particular, the governments of Austria, the governments of Switzerland, and the Netherlands, to see whether there will be any possibility to hold the reconference in an earlier date at different facilities, non-UN facilities. We just started the process. I'm still waiting for responses, preliminary responses from the 3 governments, but also the offer is open to any state parties that may believe that they can't hold and organize the reconference in their own capitals. Obviously, having the reconference at outside New York, but in particular outside UN premises, will present a major logistical challenge, because we'll have to fly, we have just to move most of the UN staffers that normally provide support to the UN conference, to the NPT reconference from New York, from the UN Secretariat. We have to hire, obviously, interpreters in the different venues. Interpreters have not been working with the UN. There will be a challenge for state parties without diplomatic representations at the venue, if it's not New York, in particular if it's not Vienna or Geneva, where many state parties have diplomatic representations. But if we go to another venue, that will be a challenge. And then for that, probably a travel fund will be necessary, and for which we'll have to do some fundraising too. So it will be a matter of logistics, it will be a matter of financial implications, will be obviously more additional cost, and obviously the representations of all state parties, because we have to assure that the conference is not only meaningful, but also is equitable, that all state parties will have the equal rights to participate in equal terms. So this is where we stand. I hope to have just more details, or at least information from those governments and also from the UN Secretariat about options, so that I can present the different options to state parties, hopefully before the 15th of February. We have only 8 days to that. Because in particular, delegations would like to have a formal decision on the dates and the venue 3 months in advance of the Rio conference. I have said that this is not a precondition. I always try to get those 3 months in advance decisions, but if we cannot match that, should not be an impediment for the Rio conference to go ahead. So we'll do our best. But if we were to apply the 3 months, it's not a principle, it's not a condition, but a requirement, then probably the April dates is already too late. But I'm not, as I say, those are not prerequisite. And last but not least, obviously taking into account the health of delegations and UN personnel. And if we're going to have the reconference at a non-UN facility, any staff provided by the government or on a commercial basis. So we have to be highly responsible for the health of everyone participating, including, I hope so, civil society representations. I believe that if we are going to have the conference at a venue outside the UN, probably will have a much more open or lenient approach to civil society participation, not because of the UN position regarding civil society, but because of the current self-restricting regulations of the UN as a whole regarding the non-presence of civil society at UN facilities, at least in New York. This is what I'm aware of. I don't know what the situation in Vienna or in Geneva, but at least in New York, civil society is not allowed into the UN building, period. Not only for the NPT, it's for any meetings to be held at a UN headquarters. So also, I'm of the view that if we were to have the NPT Review Conference at a venue that is not run by the UN, hopefully we can have a much more flexible approach regarding civil society participation, which is a very important element for any NPT Review Conference. I know that Tariq has been just a champion among many others pushing for that, and so am I. And there are many state parties to the NPT that they believe that it's key for to provide more legitimization to the review process. So those are the challenges we are facing now. I think I will stop now here. I'm not entering into the substantive parts, as I say that Mrs. Nakamitsu mentioned all of them, and I fully agree with them, and probably Alexander Mentz and the other panelists and members will address them. I will be glad to answer questions on substance later on. But let me stop right now here, Tariq. And again, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. We thank you for your continuing efforts. You've never really given up on holding this conference, so we thank you. I have one quick question before we move to Alexander, which is what will happen with the PrepCom for the next review cycle, which would be held in April, May? And later on, you could also mention, in previous talks, you've mentioned green shoots of cooperation, whether there is still life in some of these green shoots that you saw earlier on.
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly, regarding the next review cycle, and in particular the first PrepCom, is something that now is up in the air, in the sense that the whole cycle process have been totally, just being interrupted or being, modified by the postponement of the 10th NPT review conference. Just to remind everyone that traditionally, the dates of the following review cycle of the 3 PrepComs and of the following review conferences normally are decided at the latest NPT review conference. So you cannot, the UN Secretariat cannot book the dates for the PrepComs or the review conferences until having formally decided. So because we have been postponing our review conference, there is no booking. There's no dates that the UN Secretary have booked for the PrepComs, nor the 11th NPT review conference, which I would say that is problematic. We know that the way that the UN works is that you need several years in advance to book, such large gatherings. And the longer we take to make a decision, the more challenging, more difficult will be to find those dates. So, but also is a question about whether state parties will decide to continue with a 5 years review cycle. And if we have the review conference, say in August this year, then they will have a 1 year gap in 2023, and then have the first PrepCom in 2024, and so forth, or just to shorten up the next review cycle. So this is something that state party will have to decide it at the review conference. I heard informally different views from delegations. There are some who prefers to keep the 5 years review cycle, and doesn't matter whether that will push the 11th review conference to 2027. And others are of the view that because of the importance of the issues, we have to shorten up the next review cycle. So it's something that it have to be discussed, it have to be decided at the review conference. And in the meanwhile, the UN Secretariat cannot make any tentative bookings, and that is a risk in the sense that when the decision is going to be made, we may not have the dates or the conferences and facilities for the dates that state parties would like to have the first PrepCom. So it's going to be a challenge. And regarding your question, which is directly to the substance, and yes, in the past I have mentioned some signs of green shoots, and I believe that they're still there. They need to be tender. Obviously, the new geopolitical and security, international security environment is not conducive to that. But it's quite interesting that, and I know that for many, the P5 statement in December or in January, it was not enough, it was not good enough, but it was negotiated already, and in particular between just the Russian delegation, the US delegations, among the other P3, already in a moment of crisis, because of the situation we are facing in part of in Europe. So even there, at the highest, almost the highest of that crisis, those delegations agreed on the statements. So I know it's not enough, as Izumi said that the statement, the P5 statement, is a good step, is a positive step in the right direction, but need to be followed up by concrete, real and practical steps in nuclear, in the reduction of nuclear arsenals. But I believe that I've still been optimistic, as always have been, that when we meet at the reconference, we are going to have a meaningful reconference, and I believe that we can get some agreements. I hope so.
Good, thank you. So just a little point. You mentioned P5, it's the statement of the nuclear weapon states. And you know, one of the nuclear weapon states issued it as a P5 statement, and they had to withdraw it and put a correction. So as a friend of yours, and as I think for the president, he should refer to it as the nuclear weapon states, because in the NPT, we don't have a P5. I know it's a small point, but words matter.
No, look, you know, you and our Egyptian colleagues and many others pointed to that to me, but, you know, just, you know, you and others may know that I'm dyslexic. So sometimes, you know, I say something different. You know, I think when I'm saying what I say, that's not. And always I mean to say nuclear weapon state, and I know that this is the right, you know, just concept. So yes, it's a nuclear weapon state that happen to be state party to the NPT, because you have other nuclear weapon states. So also it's also a bit confusing. It's also it's a bit confusing too. Exactly.
All right,
Thank you.
Good, thanks. So now let's get into some of the substance, and we have Ambassador Alexander Clement, and we'll ask him to talk about the NPT and also about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and the Treaty on the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons. It was under his leadership that the Vienna Conference was held on humanitarian consequences here in 2014, and also the Austrian delegation at the 2015 review conference had a joint communique which was supported by 159 states parties to the NPT. Alexander.
Thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to speak at this panel, and I'm grateful to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and to Atomic Reporters, and thanks to you, Tariq, for the kind introduction. Of course, I also hope the NPT review conference can take place soon, given the geopolitical tensions that we see at the moment. Opportunities for engagement and for multilateralism are urgently needed. Of course, we fear that these tensions may overshadow the work in the NPT, but hope that this will not be the case, or not be too much the case. States like Austria look at these treaties as key aspects of the international order that's based on international law and cooperation. And for us, these treaties are absolutely crucial, and we support them fully. It's often said, and also the High Representative stated, that the NPT has been successful in preventing or limiting the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and indeed that's the case, and we need to be extremely grateful for the NPT to have achieved this. But as a framework to actually overcome the nuclear weapons challenge in a way of moving away from the nuclear weapons paradigm, the NPT has not been successful. Hopes for nuclear disarmament have not been fulfilled, and just looking at the past 10, 11 years since the last time the NPT states parties agreed on an outcome, there have been very alarming developments. I'm just listing the most important ones. There has been no pursuit of nuclear arms control negotiations by 3 of the 5 nuclear weapon states. We've seen decisions to increase nuclear arsenals. We've seen nuclear modernization programs that extend nuclear arsenals further into the future than the NPT has been enforced so far. We've seen decisions to increase the readiness for nuclear forces. We've seen decisions to increase capabilities of nuclear forces. We've seen decisions to add new nuclear weapon types to arsenals. We've seen decisions to violate or to abandon nuclear agreements. There are decisions to improve the capability to produce nuclear weapons. And we've seen decisions to reduce nuclear transparency. And lately, there's the possibility of moving nuclear weapons into third countries, which would be in addition to the already existing nuclear sharing arrangement that exists. So we've seen extremely little progress in the implementation of nuclear disarmament commitments, for example, the 2010 action plan. And in fact, we've seen developments very much to the opposite effect. And all of this takes place, of course, against the background of increasing geopolitical tensions, and in part complemented by very dangerous rhetoric about nuclear weapons. And it's not by accident that the doomsday clock that you mentioned stands at 100 seconds before midnight. So The net result of these developments is that the nuclear disarmament process of the NPT, such as there ever was one, has lost a lot of credibility. And this is a reason for concern for Austria and for many other countries if one of the pillars of the NPT looks like this. And it has, of course, a negative impact on the whole treaty. Indeed, a very negative impact. Now, of course, there are positive developments as well. The START extension, the focus on dialogue on nuclear risk reduction, the recent statement of the 5 nuclear weapon states that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And then, of course, we hope that the JCPOA will be salvaged. But what are the consequences if the nuclear weapon states are obviously unable or unwilling to fulfill their disarmament obligations? What should non-nuclear weapon states do? Do they have agency beyond lamenting or trying to appeal to nuclear weapon states to disarm, or can they actually do something? And I think this is where the TPNW comes in, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is one recent development that I would like to highlight, is what non-nuclear weapon states can do to implement their own obligations from the NPT. Now, the TPNW establishes a comprehensive norm against nuclear weapons that is based on humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons. It juxtaposes the assumed security benefit of nuclear weapons for some states with the empirically demonstrable catastrophic humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons for all humanity. It makes a compelling and universal case for more urgency for nuclear disarmament, and it does complement Article 6 of the NPT. And it demonstrates that these weapons of mass destruction, by their catastrophic and indiscriminate way of functioning, should be unacceptable for all humanity, and thus strengthens the taboo against nuclear weapons as such, and is therefore complementing the NPT's non-proliferation norm. The TPNW entered into force a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, and TPNW states parties are now preparing for the first meeting of states parties, and I have the honor of facilitating this process as president designate of the first meeting of states parties. We just recently took the decision to postpone the meeting for a few months to ensure inclusivity, which of course is also extremely important for the TPNW. But states parties of this treaty in the preparatory process so far approached this in an extremely serious and constructive way, despite the antagonism that comes from some quarters. Because we are confident about the arguments on which the TPNW rests, and we are reassured about the need to press forward in making the case of moving away from a security approach that's based on the threat of mass destruction. The TPNW meeting of states parties will take place over 3 days, either in June or in July. But on the day preceding will be a one-day conference on focused on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. You referred to that, Tariq. It's a long time since the international community focused on these issues at conference in 2013 and 2014. And many delegations have changed, delegates have moved on. And we feel it is extremely important to recapitulate what was presented then and to look at new research that has happened in the years since, and some extremely important work has indeed been done on these issues, both as regards humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons. The TPNW is grounded in an understanding of common and human security. And I'm, of course, happy to talk more about it in the Q&A session. But there's one important development in this context, and I've already referred to it, and you have referred to it, which is the recent statement of the 5 nuclear weapon states, reiterating the Reagan-Gorbachev statement from the 1980s that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And this is indeed an extremely important notion, also in the context of the TPNW discussion. Because, of course, the reason why a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought is the humanitarian consequences that this would bring. And this is precisely the premise of the TPNW. So such a statement is, of course, to be welcomed, and it has been welcomed. but it is not enough. It needs to be followed through by concrete actions. And I think if this statement is to be taken seriously, it must also lead to a broad engagement with the arguments on which the TPNW rests, namely the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and the risks that these weapons entail, and the conclusions that must be drawn from a serious focus on these aspects. And here again, I would reiterate what Izumi Nakamitsu said: nuclear risk reduction is extremely important, but it is not enough. So I hope that this statement will lead to a much more constructive engagement on these aspects, also by those who have so far belittled or criticized the TPNW and have not really engaged on these arguments. The next review conference of the NPT will be, or would be, an important opportunity to do that. And I'm absolutely convinced that the shared concern to prevent these these humanitarian consequences, which is not only a key dimension of the NPT, but also of the TPNW, but it is also, in fact, the shared platform from which credible progress on nuclear disarmament can be achieved. And this is also the essential element to sustain the NPT. And I'm convinced that this can only be achieved by a credible implementing of the past commitments on nuclear disarmament, on the NPT. I think exactly this focus on the humanitarian consequences and risks is a shared platform from which to achieve this. I think I'll stop here and look forward to comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, and thank you to Austria and the core group on the humanitarian issue for, in a sense, now being the conscience of the NPT. You again mentioned the nuclear weapon states joint statement, and that they, for the first time, all five agreed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, as did the United States and Russia last year. But the Reagan-Gorbachev statement actually goes much further. It has three parts to it. So one is this, but the two other parts are equally important, which is that neither side will fight a conventional or a nuclear war. And the third part was that neither side will strive to seek military superiority. And even though the weapon states now talk about not fighting a nuclear war, they are not observing the two other parts. There is still a race for military superiority, and we don't know whether or not there will be a conventional war. So one quick question, since you mentioned the humanitarian issue, there's a video clip going on that people can find on YouTube. And in that, we see President Putin of Russia making a statement that if Russia sees incoming nuclear missiles, Russia would launch on warning. And then he concludes by saying that the other side, that the Russian side will go to heaven, but the other side will go to hell. So how can we read this statement? And also, if we look at the US's nuclear posture review, they also talk about using nuclear weapons to restore strategic stability. So I was wondering, from the humanitarian perspective, how would the Austria and the core group respond to this loose talk about nuclear weapons, A, to restore strategic stability, and also this thing about who goes to heaven and who goes to hell?
No, thank you. I think I referred in my remarks to very sort of reckless rhetoric about nuclear weapons, and these kind of statements is what I had in mind. And in fact, you have seen more of that. You have heard talk about fire and fury, or there are all sorts of, unfortunately, all sorts of examples for that. And the problem, and I think that is a key conclusion of the humanitarian initiative. It's, I mean, highly problematic, of course, if President Putin makes these statements about Russia and the US. And I think it would be very much up to the population of those countries to hold their leaders to account. The problem is that these consequences are not restricted to Russia or the US. And we have empirically demonstrable fact proof of the global impact. And what is the legitimacy of a security approach like that? Loose talk leaving aside, if the whole world is held hostage to the actions of individuals who hold these views. And I think this is essentially the democratic underpinning of the TPNW that is so important. This is a global issue and everybody has a stake in it. We can prove, we know that these weapons do not respect borders. So I think it raises all sorts of extremely important issues of international law, of course, but also of the legitimacy of the nuclear status quo as we have it. I think it's a perfect example of the rationale on which the TPNW rests.
Before I move on to Ambassador Holgren, I might just add that Professor Scott Sagan of Stanford University did a poll a few years ago, and in that poll, nearly 60% of those who were polled in the US were supporting fighting a nuclear war with Russia. So it also shows how public perceptions can also be corrupted.
Yeah, but that is lack of knowledge, unfortunately. That is also a key aspect of the humanitarian approach, is actually moving away from the abstraction of concepts of nuclear deterrence and actually talking about what does this really mean to human beings and to communities. And I'm pretty sure that if you have this conversation in an inclusive way, the polls that you refer to would look somewhat different. Thanks.
So now may I invite Ambassador Jakob Holgren to update us regarding the Swedish-led Stockholm initiative on nuclear disarmament to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. Sweden played an important role as part of the New Agenda Coalition at the 2000 NPT Review Conference, where one of our achievements was to get the nuclear weapon states to agree to this formulation of an unequivocal commitment to nuclear disarmament and 13 practical steps, which were not really implemented. And we shouldn't forget that the very first NPT Review Conference, which was held in 1975, was presided over by a Swede, Ambassador Inga Thorsson, Ambassador for Disarmament at that time. So Jakob, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tariq, for that introduction. And let me just extend also my thanks to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and to Atomic Reporters for organizing this, and also for inviting me. I feel very humbled to be invited to this distinguished panel to talk about the Stockholm Initiative. So what I would like to do is to say something about the origins or the background and the purpose of the Stockholm Initiative and the context within which it was created. And then, as other also mentioned, the more recent developments with the postponement of the RevCon in January, the 3rd of January statement, and some words about outlook in terms of the substance for the upcoming review conference. And let me first just, Tariq, say that the Stockholm Initiative, of course, carries the name of Stockholm, but it is co-led with Germany, and there is, of course, another 14 states that are part of this initiative, and another 20 or 25 aligned. And I think just to go back a little bit, talking to why and how it was formed and created back in 2019, I think we need to look at how the world looked in 2019 in advance of the 50th anniversary and the upcoming of NPT and the upcoming 10th review conference in 2020, and the incredible, we're talking about a difficult and serious geostrategic, geopolitical situation today. But if we just look back and think a little bit about the deep mistrust that happened at that time, especially an unpredictable United States at that time under the Trump administration. Obviously, the erosions of the arms treaties and the fear that the New START would not be extended after the expiry or the cessation of the INF, and not to mention the JCPOA. And then, as Alexander just mentioned, the TPNW, of course, was signed in 2017, which is, of course, now part of the disarmament architecture. Still, I think it's also fair to say that it led to a difficult and divisive debate in many countries. Sweden was indeed one of them, where this led to a very difficult discussion whether to join or not to join. And in Sweden's case, it ended up with the conclusion not to ratify, but to become an observer. And there are many reasons for that. We could talk more about that if you like. But I think the key realization and the key conviction was, of course, that the NPT is, after all, the most universal treaty in the disarmament and proliferation domain. It has been said by Tariq and others, but the number of ratification of state parties, the fact that we have difficult cases of non-proliferation today, but they could have been so many more if you remember the discussions back in the 1960s before the signature of the NPT, and of course that all state parties are there. Non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states are there. And it's the only platform where that discussion is still going on today. So the Stockholm Initiative was born and got traction in that context, with a wish to revitalize the NPT, a wish, and Alexander mentioned it, a very strong need to revitalize the disarmament pillar of the NPT, but also a wish to build bridges and, of course, to re-acknowledge earlier agreements and commitments. But somehow there was this idea that it needs to be very ambitious, but still realistic in order to be able to reach and be able to talk to all state parties concerned for these existential issues. And that's where this idea of a stepping stones methodology was born, which is essentially that if we start by smaller steps, that will lead to more steps. The fact that the Stockholm Initiative, I mentioned 16 states all in all before, was able to attract a broad number and type of countries, wide geographical background, different security situations, some state parties to the TPNW, others nuclear umbrella states, I think may have added to why this is talked about still today. Obviously, the delays that the pandemic has brought upon us, that Gustavo just talked about, have been painful. But in terms of the issues that underpin and the convictions of the Stockholm Initiative, I think it has actually only strengthened the enthusiasm for and the conviction for the importance of this issue. So as I mentioned before, 16 member countries from the beginning, another 20 or 25 aligned. And in addition to that stepping stones paper with the 22 suggestions, another paper, as you all know, was tabled last summer on nuclear risk reduction, which was developed by the Swiss colleagues. So things have happened, and it has kind of deepened and become stronger. Now, today's context, as others have alluded to, is of course no less serious in terms of the geopolitical ramifications of what is happening. Someone mentioned the risk of war in Europe, and the tensions wider afield between the United States and China, on Taiwan, South China Sea, etc., are of course very worrying. The tensions between Russia and the United States on Ukraine, regarding the European security order, and not to mention the rhetoric about the use of nuclear weapons that Alexander mentioned. But there has been an extension of the New START agreement a year ago, and the strategic stability talks have started to happen between Russia and the United States, and there is a commitment that it would start between the US and China as well. And then we do have the statement of the 3rd of January that you have all talked about, between 5 nuclear weapon states. And I think, as Gustavo mentioned, I mean, it should not be underestimated that it did happen in the midst of that extremely serious escalation that is happening between Russia and the United States and European countries, with Ukraine as the hot spot. I think that is significant. So I think it's fair to say, and I also speak on behalf of the Stockholm Initiative when I say that we also think that this is a very welcome development. It's the first time ever that these 5 states have committed that truth. So we strongly support that is happening. That statement was read in the conference of disarmament last week. It could be found on the website of the Stockholm Initiative. And I think that this dialogue between the 5 countries, state parties that signed this declaration, is more important than ever. France has led that, and after the end of the upcoming RevCon, the United States will take over as coordinator, and we can only encourage them to continue that discussion so that it leads to a concrete follow-up. But because, as others have said, concrete follow-up and more detail is of course needed as a consequence of what was said on the 3rd of January. So we from the Stockholm Initiative will also continue to press these countries for progress. I think that this statement that was made by the United Nations Secretary General Guterres was also very helpful, was an excellent statement, and we agree that we look forward to the details of the implementation. So when it comes to the upcoming review conference and what the Stockholm Initiative will do there, as I said before, I think it is probably strong. It has become stronger due to the unfortunate delays and postponements. There are other excellent initiatives around the NPT, NPDI. Tariq mentioned the New Agenda Coalition, and it's obviously the substance of progress that matters rather than any initiative. And I think it's fair to say, I mean, the Stockholm Initiative represents a broad agenda of some quite difficult issues, but completely possible if there is a political will. I think we will try to look out for whatever looks like backsliding from previous commitments. But we have also, when we look at where interests are and where they converge across communities, we, among nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapons states, we have of course seen that there is an emerging discussion about nuclear risk reduction. As I mentioned, the Swiss in the Stockholm Initiative tabled an excellent paper, quite an ambitious such paper last summer. So needless to say, that's one area where we would like to see progress, both on text and on substance, and hopefully also a process over the next review cycle. And as others have said, it's extremely important to make sure that it is about disarmament and not some kind of consolidation of this deterrence policies. So I think when it comes to the outcomes of the next and upcoming conference, we cannot disregard and we cannot be naive and unrealistic about the geopolitical situation and the tension. And I think others have mentioned the uncertainties about technological development, and the uncertainty is, of course, an enemy in itself, because that increases insecurity. But I think that our goal must be that all state parties agree on an consensual outcome document of sorts. That's certainly going to be our ambition. And in that context, as others said, we're encouraged by the fact that the 3rd of January statement was made in the midst of that difficult situation. Maybe it shows a sober view regarding the risks of these existential issues that can distinguish that from other more conventional threat. That and nuclear risk reduction will, of course, not be enough, and we fully support everything that was said about the need for inclusivity, civil society, youth, equal participation, etc. And of course, last but not least, good faith and a will to be flexible from all state parties around. Thank you very much, Tariq. I'm sorry for the long talk.
No, that was very good, Jakob. Thank you very much for giving us that update. So I have here the Stockholm 5th ministerial statement of the initiative from the 14th of December last year. And so it has a very interesting paragraph, which is, I think, what Undersecretary General Izumi mentioned, as well as Alexander and Gustavo. And the ministers say that they want the weapon states to take clear and decisive steps to lay the groundwork for next generation arms control arrangements to reduce or further reduce nuclear arsenals, and show leadership in ending nuclear weapon testing and commence negotiations on an FMCT. But the perception out there is that the Stockholm Initiative is focusing more on risk reduction rather than on actual disarmament measures. Because one might say, if there are fewer nuclear weapons, we have fewer risks. So if we just talk about nuclear risk reduction, and like the Swiss have proposed, have a subsidiary body discussion in the NPT review conference, that is good, but it doesn't lead to actual reductions of nuclear weapons, which are the ones that create the risks.
Yeah, as I did mention already during my talk, it is extremely important that any work that is done on nuclear risk reduction is not some kind of an excuse for disarmament. And I think I'm convinced and very, I mean, I can say that in the discussions within the initiative, this has been extremely clear. And I think we've seen with some worry the mentioning of strategic risk reduction rather than nuclear risk reduction as a part and a necessary step towards disarmament of nuclear weapons. I think it represents a real risk which is out there, and I think it's probably going to be the responsibility of all state parties who work for real and concrete disarmament to make sure that this does not, as I said already in my remarks, become some kind of a consolidation of deterrence policies. But I mentioned that because that's an area where there is an ongoing discussion with the nuclear weapon states. But I also said that it's certainly not the only of the steps and the proposals within the Stockholm Initiative which we will push for, and which are of course equally important, whether it is the FMCT, verification, reduction, CTBT, ratification, etc., etc., etc. And so, but I think it's a fair question, but I can reassure you that it's a widely held view within the initiative that it cannot become some kind of a replacement for disarmament.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Now may I invite Councillor Maria Antonietta Jaques, Tony, as she is well known in the non-proliferation community, to inform us about the efforts of Mexico regarding the NPT including those of the New Agenda Coalition as well. I might note that the concept of nuclear weapon-free zones that predates the NPT was first initiated in Mexico by Nobel Peace Prize winner Garcia Robles, who also played a key role in getting the first unsought final document, which in a sense lays the groundwork for a lot of current disarmament fora. Tony, over to you.
Thank you, Tariq. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you to the organizers also for inviting me. And I also am very humbled of speaking after such experienced and well-known and experts, ambassadors. And in a way, it's easy to speak after them because they have explained to the audience and to the participants everything that I needed to say. I don't have to disagree with them, and I don't. I just need to clarify some issues and some concepts from the point of view of Mexico, and also from the point of view of some of the non-nuclear weapon states of the Global South. Although I am not a representative for them, but I see some trends and some coincidences between, for example, non-nuclear weapon states that are in nuclear weapon-free zones in our positions regarding the NPT and the recent developments. So first and foremost, I have to say that, of course, we regret the postponement of the NPT. We know that it was something that needed to be done, and we need to put our safety at the first and foremost place. But we think that this is also a good, has to be seen as a good opportunity to continue discussing the substantive issues of the conference, and also to listen, not only to reply or to have a position, but also to understand the others. And that is something that we do very, very scarcely often at the multilateral arena. We just listen to reply, to respond quickly, not to understand each other. So that's why it is important to continue fostering dialogue. And this is the reason why the New Agenda Coalition, as Tariq asked me to explain, and I will start here. The New Agenda Coalition that is formed by Brazil, Egypt, Ireland, Mexico, New Zealand, and South Africa posted a statement in response, if we want to say it like that, or in reaction to the statement by the nuclear weapon states that has been referred here in several occasions. I am going to explain a little bit what the position of the New Agenda Coalition is in a nutshell, so that everybody has clarity on why it was important to respond or to have a statement in response or in reaction or in parallel. It is important for the international community to continue the dialogue. So we cannot accept that there is only one view or one part of the narrative floating in the air without any reaction or response to what this means. And this is why it was important to say that, yes, we have taken note that at a time when the tensions have been heightened, and we have spoken about this here, the exacerbation of the tension and the friction in the international arena. The joint statement by the nuclear weapon states it's a necessary effort and very welcome effort because politics is signals in the end, and this is a signal of an effort to stabilize strategic relations. The New Agenda Coalition hopes that this is a signal that there is going to be some greater cooperation amongst the nuclear weapon states and the fulfillment of their nuclear disarmament obligations. In particular, the NAC highlighted the affirmation that has been referred several times here in the conversation of the Reagan-Gorbachev statement, or partially the Reagan-Gorbachev statement of that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought as an important signal, but that has to be translated into concrete actions. and it doesn't have the feeling of being sufficient. And maybe that is something that is going to be a complaint by the nuclear weapon states or by other states, why non-nuclear weapon states always feel that this is not enough and this is not sufficient. And I want to say a couple of comments on my part. Okay, so the problem with these signals and the statements by the nuclear weapon states and by some of their allies is that there is no recognition of the fact that the majority of the countries in the world in the world are already rejected the nuclear option, and 116 of the states in the international community have signed the denuclearized zone treaties, the nuclear weapon-free zones treaties. As Tariq said before, these have some of them preceded the NPT. So before even the NPT, countries were already denying the nuclear option. So for the majority of countries in the world, nuclear weapons are not useful. They are not valued in their national doctrines and for their national interests, and they are considered as an existential threat. And this is not a recognition that has been at the forefront of the discussion in the NPT framework, I have to say. There is a trend to consider this assertion, this recognition that nuclear weapons or the mere existence of nuclear weapons is a threat. It's considered unrealistic or naive. And that is one part of the narrative that has to be addressed by the non-nuclear weapon states. The other part of the narrative that is very frequent is that when we talk about the obligations of the non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT and the commitments, the political commitments of the non-nuclear weapon states are considered as matter-of-factly obligatory, and that the countries have to pursue them, accept them, implement them in full, without any condition and without any nuance. Whereas the obligations and the commitments of the nuclear weapon states have to be always seen through the lens of the international juncture. So we end up saying, well, the landscape, the geopolitical landscape, the geopolitical conditions are very difficult today. So we understand that. That's why we understand that it's very difficult for the nuclear weapon states to fulfill with their obligations. And this is regarded by some voices in the room as the realistic or the positive note in the discourse. So this creates yet another layer of asymmetry for the non-nuclear weapon states acting in the NPT review conference. So this is why the dialogue and the exercises of collaboration between non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states in the preparation of the review conference have to be more strengthened towards a recognition of the validity of all obligations and all commitments for all the parties in the review cycles and in the treaty without any consideration of excuses or caveats for implementation. Because otherwise we may end up with more asymmetries than the ones that already exist in the treaty. Okay, so for the non-nuclear weapon states, it is important to see is also some declaratory value in the statements of the nuclear weapon states, and that's why the statement of June the 3rd is very important. But this has to be accompanied with some actions, and as one of the interventions before me, the one of Ambassador Kmentz pointed out very clearly, we are seeing a very troubling new developments and scenarios from the declaratory nuclear poster reviews and announcements and statements towards the enhancement of arsenals, modernization of arsenals, including the banalization of the use of nuclear weapons by some of the nuclear weapon states. We passed from an era in which we had the presidents, some of the presidents of the nuclear weapon states boasting about the size of their buttons, about the size of their arsenals, about the fire and fury, etc., to now a new era in which they are heightening the tensions and saying that all options are on the table and letting everybody wonder what options we are talking about. And this type of fear makes voices in the media and in the academia and in the think tanks and some civil society, including some organizations in Europe, in Asia, and even in Latin America, say, why did we get rid of nuclear weapons? We should have nuclear weapons so that nobody would mess with us. And this justification of the validity of nuclear weapons is another of the battles that we have to fight internally for the validity of our previous commitments and obligations. This is why it is very important to continue reminding ourselves the why all the disarmament obligations and commitments have to be fulfilled. And this is the reminder of the effects of the nuclear weapons. We have to remember that one of the most important developments that have occurred within the context of the review cycles of the NPT in the past 20 years is the consideration of the consequences of nuclear weapons. Before 2010, within the NPT context, we were accustomed to just talking about who has nuclear weapons, who had nuclear weapons, who deserved nuclear weapons according to their own national priorities, and who couldn't have or couldn't acquire nuclear weapons. We didn't talk about the effects of nuclear weapons from the point of view of the 21st century society. We have to remind ourselves that the 21st century society has made some predictions and some research about what effects would have these weapons would have in our society, and from the point of view of the concerns of the societies of this century, not based on preoccupations or varieties or variables of the past. This talk has changed the dynamics within the NPT review conference for the better, because now there is a more mainstreaming approach to talking about the consequences of nuclear weapons. Some of the inter-regional groupings in the context of the NPT, such as the NPDI, such as the Stockholm Initiative, and other very important groupings that have assessed the situation and tried to forge some bridges and some positions that can be adopted by both nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states, are leaning towards a recognition of this concern. And the concern on the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons has to be the basis of a very good outcome for 2022. The issue here is to recognize that this is not a naive position, and that this is not an issue that it is far from reality. In fact, from the point of view of Mexico, this is an expression of realism, because we are talking about what weapons do. We are not basing our qualification or our consideration of a weapon or of the effects of a treaty based on ideology, like deterrence. We are talking about what weapons do based on the historical proof that we have from the nuclear weapons attacks and tests in the 20th century. So we think that the more we approach the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation disarmament fora through the lens of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, we are going to have a more solid rationale for our actions and a more compelling argument for implementation. And this has not been new. It is new in the kind of new in the NPT context since 2010, but it is also embedded in the nuclear weapon-free zones treaties, in the CTBT, and it is part of the consideration for the prohibition and elimination of other regimes like the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention. I have always been fascinated by the fact that the Biological Weapons Convention dares to qualify the weapons in the preamble as repugnant. And we have not been able to qualify nuclear weapons in our treaties in that way until very recently. So this is why this qualification and this conceptualization of what weapons do for the majority of states in the international community is permeating more and more why we need to continue demanding the implementation of all the provisions of the treaty in an equal manner, not with conditions, caveats, and nuances in the consideration. I will stop, and of course I am very keen to answer any question, but I want to just finalize by saying that the unequivocal undertaking by the nuclear weapon states to accomplish the total elimination of their nuclear arsenals was part of the agreements of the 2000 review conference. And when non-nuclear weapon states refer to commitments and obligations, we refer to that. This is maybe not, we need to be clearer about demanding this as the part of the treaty that has not been fulfilled, the pending assignment also for the General Assembly to fulfill, and in the review conference might give some indication in that regard. So far, we have a very important demonstration of will to adhere to the NPT provisions and obligations by the nuclear weapon states, but not an express reminder of that commitment on their part. And maybe that's where we need to be insisting. Thank you, Tarek.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for that presentation. I'm glad you mentioned the continuing obligation to implement previous commitments. And I'm glad that the Stockholm Initiative does talk about that the validity of both 2000 and 2010. For some reason, they didn't mention 1995. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here because the treaty wouldn't have been here today. I was also looking at Garcia Robles's Nobel Peace Prize lecture that he gave in 1982. And I want to quote something which I think is important. He said, "The Treaty of Tlatelolco has contributed effectively to dispel the myth that for the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone, it would be essential requirement that all states of the region concerned should become, from the very outset, parties to the treaty establishing the zone." So the reason why I mentioned this, I think this could be useful for the Middle East zone. We don't necessarily need everyone to start with. I was wondering whether you might say something to that. And also, same thing goes for the TPNW. So we are at the end of our time. So I will ask I will put some questions that came into each one of you. And if you could finish up in 1 or 2 minutes, and I sort of ask for your indulgence for the speakers to stay on for about 10 minutes more. So Tony, so if you could say something to that and also any closing thing, and then I will go on to the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq, for reminding us of the Nobel lecture of Ambassador Garcia Robles. In fact, this is a must read for all interested scholars and researchers and diplomats. And I just want to say it's something that I was talking a few months ago with Ambassador Holgren about remembering that this year is the 40th anniversary of the Nobel Peace Prize to Alfonso Garcia Robles and Alba Mirdan. So it is an important landmark anniversary to remember. The statement also talks about the organic relationship between disarmament and peace. And I want to start by addressing this because this sounds like a very obvious question, but no. In the United Nations, we are accustomed to talking, especially some of these fora, about the relationship between weapons and peace, and how weapons have sustained peace. But no, it's disarmament the one that sustains peace. About the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East and other examples, yeah, we believe that it is important not to wait for all the parties of or special important stakeholders to join treaties. If we waited for that important stakeholders to join, we wouldn't have the conventions on the right of children. We wouldn't have the Convention on the Law of the Sea. We wouldn't have the CTBT in the way it is implementing the monitoring system. So we think that the standard, the legal standard, is important. We need to have a reference, a horizon that qualifies as a very fine line between the law of the jungle and civilization. And that's what treaties do. So we shouldn't wait for everybody to be on board in order to continue advancing the disarmament law, especially the nuclear weapon-free zones treaties. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think the same goes for the NPT, because France and China joined later, as did Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, and so on. So next I'll go to Ambassador Holgren. Foreign Minister Lind has mentioned that she would head the Swedish delegation to the 10th Review Conference, and Sweden would play an important role. And both you and I were in Cyprus when the former Foreign Minister Margot Wallström went to the 2015 Review Conference and had a special event with former IAEA Director General Hans Blix, among others. So I was wondering whether you might say what might be Sweden's priorities at the review conference, and what Foreign Minister Lind might have in mind beyond the Stockholm Initiative from Sweden's perspective, which traditionally has been a neutral country and has contributed to NPT review conferences besides the one in 2000.
Thank you, Tarif. Excellent questions, and thank you also to Tony for reminding us of the 40th anniversary this year of Garcia Robles and Myrdal's Nobel Peace Prize for these very pertinent questions. So that's a good reason to hope for a successful outcome of RevCon this year. I can assure you that Foreign Minister Ann Linde is personally very committed to this. Only 2 weeks ago, we had a heads of missions and ambassadors meeting internally within the Swedish ministry. And I know that she edited and added to the notes that she was supposed to deliver to urge us all to work hard to promote a positive outcome, and of course also the Stockholm Initiative. So that's high on her priority agenda. Obviously, Sweden has a national priority, but it very much converges with the priorities of the Stockholm Initiative, and it might change here and there in some nuances. It's clear that the government wants to see progress under Pillar 1, and it's also clear that we see the NPT as the preeminent and very important arena and forum for these issues. It must be safeguarded, and it must advance. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexander, I have a question here from Senator Doug Roach, whom you met in Ottawa when you received the Simons Award for your work on the TPNW, and people can see Alexander's book behind my left shoulder, the green and white cover. So the question is, which I think he asked you in Ottawa as well, how could NATO non-nuclear weapon states somehow be brought closer to the TPNW, if not to become parties to the treaty?
Thank you very much for promoting my book. There are several points. First of all, acknowledge that the TPNW is a good faith effort by states to promote nuclear disarmament and achieve a world without nuclear weapons. That's the first thing. Secondly, by engaging constructively with the TPNW and its arguments, for example, by being an observer to the first meeting of states parties. One can agree or disagree with the legal dimension of the TPNW, but the humanitarian aspect is something surely that should provide entry points for states that are serious about nuclear disarmament. I'm pointing to the positive obligations of the TPNW on victim assistance and environmental remediation. And lastly, and that's maybe the most important point, rather than moving nuclear disarmament conceptually into a far distant future security environment where nobody really knows when this is going to be and how it's supposed to be achieved. Acknowledge it as an urgent priority for now, and state clearly that because of this urgency, they also want to move away from a nuclear deterrence-based security environment and engage in a serious process of moving away from this paradigm. And that is, I think, the problem, that we just simply do not see those states giving a credible perspective of how nuclear disarmament is to be achieved. So there are plenty of ways of engaging constructively, and that would be my answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So finally, Gustavo, I'd like you to clone yourself and make one comment as the president designate, and prior to that, say something about Argentina's priorities at the review conference, what Argentina would like to do. And Argentina and Brazil still haven't signed the additional protocol. I know this is a sensitive issue, but you can maybe say something with your Argentinian hat on that matter.
Thank you, Tariq. Unfortunately, I cannot do that. You yourself said at the beginning of this dialogue that all presentations were on a personal basis, so I cannot speak on behalf of my government. Secondly, because I have the hat of president of the NPT Review Conference, I have just to keep myself, separate from national position. However, on a personal basis, I have to say that I'm sure that my colleagues at the Argentine Foreign Ministry, we're already prepared for the review conference to take place in January, and they will continue with the long-standing tradition of Argentinian support for a full-fledged nuclear disarmament, for achieving a goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. But also they are very pragmatic in the sense that they're ready to work with any grouping of countries, but with all state parties, being nuclear weapon states or non-nuclear weapon states, on how best to achieve those goals. And that's why Argentina is a member to the Stockholm Initiative, is a very active member of that. And obviously, as a very proud member of the Tlatelolco Treaty, Argentina is very active in our region on how countries in the Latin American and the Caribbean move forward on this. Fortunately, we are a region free of nuclear weapons, but still we have some of the nuclear weapon states that have some, they have not signed or ratified the protocols to the treaty, and I think that could be also a very practical steps by the nuclear weapon states, not only with regard to the Tlatelolco Treaty, but to all others, nuclear weapon-free zones, is to lift their views or restrictions, or even to sign and ratify the corresponding protocols to all nuclear weapons-free zones treaties. That in itself, it will be a goodwill gesture and also a practical step towards, obviously, a small and long distance steps to achieving nuclear disarmament, but it could be a practical element. And you mentioned Argentina and Brazil, and I'm sure Argentina and Brazil will be obviously not coordinating because they are two sovereign states, but just exchanging information and working together, because they have a very important bilateral cooperations on peaceful uses of nuclear weapons, which also, and so I'm really sorry about that. Say it's my dyslexia. Sorry. Peaceful cooperation, peaceful uses of nuclear energy, nuclear applications, but also it's, as you say, that is in connection with the safeguards agreement. The ABAC is considered as an example of international cooperations on implementation of safeguards by state parties to the NPT. And there have been a lot of discussions and negotiations between Argentina, Brazil, and ABAC about how to improve the bilateral safeguard system working together with the agency. The agency is implementing the safeguards agreements, which is a quadripartite agreement for the implementation of safeguards agreements in all Brazilian and Argentine peaceful nuclear facilities. Whether the additional protocol is going to be added or not, this is something that the two governments have to decide. But there have been discussions, as I say, among the two governments and the agency, and we shall see. We shall see. Times will tell if and when both countries will do the next move regarding that point. That will be all that I can say on those aspects.
Any final comments as President-designate?
As a President-designate, I have to say that events like today's, it will help us get better prepared for delegations and civil society and also stakeholders for when we are going to meet. We have been delaying the review conference for too long. There are many, many important issues to be addressed, discussed, as Tony from Mexico mentioned, not only to express delegations' positions, but also to listen and to negotiate in good faith and goodwill. And we will need the political will by all, by non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states, in particular by and from the nuclear weapon states, the political will to move forward. I believe that another fiasco, another review conference without a meaningful outcome, and I'm not talking about here success or no success. I think that I've seen so many times the fact that state parties will meet and will discuss all the important issues, in my view, already will be a success. And under the current circumstances and the COVID enforced postponement, the mere meetings of the state parties during the review conference will be already a success. But what we have to do is to have a meaningful discussion, meaningful negotiations, and a meaningful outcome to further implement obligations under the treaty, and in my view, under previous commitments and the previous review conferences in all three pillars for the good of the whole humankind and towards that goal of a world free of nuclear weapons.
Very good.
I'm
Thank you very much.
we can do that. Thank you.
We had some questions from Ambassador Sultanieh, from Yuri Krivinos, Mona Khalil, a senior lawyer. You might remember Gustavo from the UN Office for Legal Affairs, where we didn't unfortunately have time to get to them. We're already over time. In conclusion, I think we can conclude on one bright spot, and that is peaceful uses of nuclear energy. We have more than 800 projects at the IAEA working in about 120 countries. So on that part of the treaty is working very well, also on the non-proliferation side to a greater extent. So with that, may I thank Gustavo, Alexander, Jakob, Tony, and also High Representative Nakamitsu for taking the time to contribute to this very important discussion here today. And again, to you, Gustavo, I think this is the third time you accepted an invitation from here in Vienna, so I thank you. And hopefully, maybe there might be another time, we'll see. So I return the proceedings back to Christina Bellman in Berlin to close the proceedings. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, Tariq. I would also like to thank you all for participating in this discussion. Thanks, Tony Hakas. Thanks, Ambassador Zlabanen. Thanks, Ambassador Kment. Thanks, Ambassador Holgren. And thank you especially also to you, Tariq, for moderating this discussion. I think you've shared with us very important insights and a very good overview of the complex situation that we're facing right now before the 10th NPT review conference. And I think we've all taken in a lot of food for thought that should be further elaborated once we get closer to the actual conference. I would also like to thank our audience from around the world for your interest in the seminar, for your good questions and comments, and also, as you already mentioned, Tariq, for staying with us even as we went into overtime a little bit. I wish Ambassador Zlabanen all the best for finding a venue for the 10th NPT review conference, and that it can be found before August date. I wish you that, and us all, that it will actually be a meaningful and an equitable conference. We will inform you about our next online event in cooperation with Atomic Reporters in due time via the usual channels that we usually reach you. And now it only remains for me to say that I wish you a pleasant start of the working week, of the rest of the week. Thank you again very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Tariq.
Thank you. Bye. Thank
Next
you.
time.
Thank you very much, Gustavo.
Bye, Alexander.
Alexander,
Tony.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.